London, November 12th, 1983. Inspector Morgan Reed looked down at Lord Victor Kensington's dead body. The wealthy aristocrat was slumped in his leather chair, a gun hanging loosely from his fingers, and blood staining the expensive carpet below. But something about the scene felt wrong to Reed, like it had been set up by someone who didn't really understand what death looked like. The bullet wound was at a strange angle. The fingers were too stiff around the gun. The half-empty whiskey glass smelled oddly medicinal underneath its normal scent. Most suspicious of all, the safe behind Lady Kensington's portrait stood open, but nothing inside appeared to be missing, and there was no key in sight. When exactly was Lord Kensington last seen alive? Reed asked the ashen-faced butler who had discovered the body. "Yesterday evening, sir. He retired to his study after dinner, requesting not to be disturbed until morning. Said he had important business matters to attend to." The butler's eyes darted nervously toward the mahogany desk, where a letter lay prominently displayed. "That was most unlike him, sir." Reed picked up the letter with gloved hands. The penmanship was impeccable, perhaps too perfect for a man supposedly contemplating his own demise. It read, "I can no longer bear the weight of financial ruin. The Kensington legacy ends with me. May God forgive my failings. Victor." "Financial ruin," Reed murmured sceptically. "The owner of half the coal mines in Yorkshire and textile mills across Manchester." Reed would soon discover that the truth behind Lord Kensington's death lay hidden beneath layers of masterful deception. The boardroom of Kensington Industries hummed with tension as Lawrence Harrington finished his presentation. At 45, his temples were greying, but his posture remained military straight, a habit from his brief service before being assigned to the War Office Accountancy Department. "Gentlemen, I know this comes as a terrible shock," Harrington said, his tone measured and professional. "Lord Kensington's death leaves us all bereft, but the company must continue." He distributed folders containing balance sheets, showing concerning trends across multiple divisions, including the pharmaceutical venture that had been Lord Kensington's passion project since the war. "Treatments for shell shock," scoffed Harold Blackwood, a board member with investments in multiple competing companies. His moustache quivered with derision. "Hardly a profitable enterprise, when half of England would rather forget the war entirely." "While I share your concerns about profitability," countered George Pembroke, Lord Kensington's oldest friend, "Victor believed deeply in this work. There must be some way to honour his legacy while addressing these financial concerns." "What concerns me," Blackwood continued, "is the timing. Victor never mentioned financial troubles at our club last week. Quite the contrary. He hinted at a breakthrough that would transform the pharmaceutical division's prospects." Arthur Wells, the company solicitor, cleared his throat. "The matter is complicated by succession. Captain Edward Kensington was the designated heir, but with his death at the Somme..." He paused. "The estate will be tied up in probate for months," Harrington finished smoothly, "which is why I propose this interim restructuring plan." Only one board member looked openly sceptical, Dr. James Winters, head of research at the pharmaceutical division. "These projections don't align with my department's reports. Our new compounds show remarkable promise. And I must say, some sensitive files appear to be missing from our records." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "What files, precisely?" "Formulations, experimental compounds." An uncomfortable silence fell across the table. After the meeting adjourned, Dr. Winters lingered, studying the financial documents. The young secretary, who had been taking minutes, approached hesitantly. "Dr. Winters? Lord Kensington asked me to give you this if anything unusual had happened to him." Winters opened it privately in his office. Inside was a brief note in Kensington's distinctive hand. "James, I fear all is not as it seems. Meet my contact at St. Bartholomew's Mission in Whitechapel as soon as you can. He has crucial information. tell no one. Victor. As Winters left the building that evening, he failed to notice the figure watching from the shadows across Berkeley Square, or the same figure following him as he headed east toward the unfamiliar territory of London's poorest district, Whitechapel. He would never arrive at his destination. Inspector Reed knelt beside Winters' body, sprawled in the alleyway behind Brick Lane. The coroner was pronouncing it a robbery gone wrong. The victim's pockets turned out, his expensive watch missing. But Reed recognised the face from the Kensington Industries board photograph he'd studied that morning. "Dr. James Winters," he murmured. "What brought you to Whitechapel, I wonder?" A constable approached, holding a sodden piece of paper found nearby. "Might be nothing, sir, but with the rain—" He handed over the partially legible note mentioning St. Bartholomew's Mission. St. Bartholomew's Mission stood on Commercial Street, a Victorian building with peeling paint. Inside, dozens of men, many still bearing visible wounds of war, sat on benches, some staring vacantly into space, others engaged in quiet conversation. "Inspector Reed, Scotland Yard," he introduced himself to the minister. "I'm inquiring about a visitor who may have come here last night, a Dr. Winters." The minister shook his head. "We had no gentlemen visitors last evening. Perhaps you might speak with Ellis. He helps with our accounting and teaches some of the men to read. He's quite observant." Reed followed the minister's gesture toward a slight figure hunched over account books in the corner. The man who looked up had a face that instantly commanded attention, not for its handsomeness, but for its contradictions. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, slightly skewing his features. Yet his eyes were intelligent, assessing Reed with a sharpness that seemed at odds with his threadbare clothing. As Ellis approached, Reed noticed the pronounced limp, the way his right hand occasionally trembled, classic signs of shell shock. But there was something else about his movement that struck the detective as peculiar, a deliberate quality, as if each halting step was somehow remembered rather than natural. "I understand you help with the books," Reed began. "Did you happen to notice anyone unusual visiting last night? A well-dressed gentleman, perhaps?" Ellis's gaze never wavered. "We get all sorts here, Inspector, though I'm afraid no one matching that description came through our doors last night. This particular gentleman would have been in his 50s, spectacled, carrying a leather medical bag." "Many avoid this area after nightfall," Ellis replied, "especially those unaccustomed to Whitechapel's dangers." Reed produced Dr. Winters' photograph. This man was found murdered nearby. His last known destination was this mission. Ellis studied the image, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry to hear of this tragedy, Inspector, but I can assure you he never arrived." As Reed pocketed the photograph, he noticed Ellis's gaze drift momentarily to the newspaper on a nearby table, open to the story of Lord Kensington's suicide. The headline was partially visible: "Industrial Magnate Takes Own Life." "Did you know Lord Kensington?" Reed asked abruptly. Ellis's reaction was perfect, a look of confusion followed by a bitter laugh. "Men like us don't move in such circles, Inspector. Lords and beggars inhabit different Londons." Yet Reed had seen the momentary tension in Ellis's scarred hand when he mentioned Kensington's name. Something wasn't right. Outside, Reed instructed a junior officer, "Watch that man, Ellis. I want to know where he goes, who he talks to." What Reed couldn't know was that Ellis had anticipated being watched and was prepared for surveillance, or that beneath the floorboards of Ellis's small room at the Mission lay a notebook filled with detailed observations of Kensington Industries board members, particularly extensive notes on Lawrence Harrington and Harold Blackwood. Sarah Williams changed the dressing on old Jenkins' persistent leg wound, her efficient hands moving with care. 3 years as a nurse on the Western Front had taught her to treat everything from minor injuries to horrific amputations, yet nothing had prepared her for the lingering aftermath of war. Men broken, not just in body, but in spirit. "You've a gentle touch, Mrs. Williams," Jenkins said gratefully. "Reminds me of the nurses at Wimereux Field Hospital." "I served there in '16, she replied with a small smile. "Perhaps we crossed paths." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion at the entrance. A delivery boy with a large hamper. "Donation from an anonymous benefactor," he announced cheerfully. "Finest foods from Fortnum and Mason." The minister accepted the gift with grateful prayers. Such generosity was rare in these difficult times. In the mission's dining hall, Ellis was distracted by a complex accounting discrepancy he'd discovered in the mission's ledgers. A pattern of small donations that seemed to originate from the same source despite coming through different channels. When the special meal was served, he absently accepted a plate and began eating while continuing to study the financial records. The meat pie was richer than their usual fare, with a distinctive flavour he couldn't immediately place. He had consumed several bites before something triggered a warning in his mind, a bitter aftertaste beneath the savoury gravy. His military intelligence training resurfaced through his carefully maintained disguise. The timing of this unexpected generosity, immediately after the police had started investigating, struck him as suspiciously convenient. Across the table, an elderly veteran suddenly clutched his throat, eyes widening in distress. The realization hit Ellis with sickening clarity. The food was poisoned. "Stop!" he called out, rising to his feet and knocking over his half-eaten plate. "Don't eat any more!" But his warning came too late for several of the men, including himself. As the elderly veteran collapsed with convulsions, Ellis turned desperately to Sarah. "Mrs. Williams, these men need medical attention immediately. The food is contaminated." Sarah rushed to the fallen man's side. "What do you suspect?" "Something chemical," Ellis said grimly, already feeling the first symptoms himself. A burning sensation in his stomach, dizziness clouding his vision. "We need to induce vomiting in anyone who's eaten this food." As Sarah worked desperately to treat the stricken men, she threw a questioning glance at Ellis, whose commanding tone and medical knowledge seemed far beyond his supposed station. By midnight, 6 men were severely ill, including Ellis himself, who fought to remain conscious despite increasing symptoms. What no one at the mission realized was that earlier that day, in the private office of Kensington Pharmaceuticals, a vial had gone missing from the experimental compounds cabinet. A nerve agent developed for battlefield use, but deemed too dangerous for deployment. Constable Parker shivered in the November chill, watching from the shadows as Ellis emerged from the mission. Despite his limp and visible illness, the man moved with purpose through Whitechapel's labyrinthine streets, expertly navigating the neighbourhood's worst areas. Parker struggled to keep pace while remaining undetected. Ellis finally entered a shabby building on Fournier Street, formerly a tailor's shop. Through a gap in the door, Parker glimpsed Ellis, transformed. The stooped posture was gone. He stood straight before a mirror, methodically removing adhesive from his face that had accentuated his scar. Parker shifted for a better view, causing a floorboard to creak. Immediately, Ellis extinguished the lamp. Parker drew his truncheon and pushed the door open, only to feel cold metal pressed against his neck. "Police constable," Ellis's voice came from behind him, "poorly trained for surveillance." Hours later, a shaken Parker returned to Scotland Yard, where Inspector Reed was working late. The constable's report was so extraordinary that Reed initially suspected fabrication, until Parker produced a sealed envelope. Inside was a pre-war photograph of Lord Kensington with a young army officer, the family resemblance unmistakable, along with military records and a handwritten letter detailing suspicious financial transactions at Kensington Industries. The letter ended with words that sent a chill through Reed's professional detachment. My father is already dead. By the time you read this, I may be growing sicker. The poison used on us at the mission appears to be a modified pharmaceutical compound. I need your help to find the person responsible before more innocent lives are lost. Signed, Captain Edward Kensington, presumed deceased. Reed stared at the signature in disbelief. Ellis is Edward Kensington, the son supposedly killed at the Somme? Parker nodded. He survived, sir. Severe facial injuries, recruited by intelligence afterward for behind enemy lines work. He returned to find his father's company being systematically plundered. By whom? Reed demanded. He has evidence implicating both Harrington and Blackwood, but couldn't determine which was ultimately responsible. That's why he created the Ellis persona, to investigate from the shadows. Reed studied the financial documents, his detective's mind, piecing together the puzzle. And his father? Was Lord Kensington's death truly suicide? No, sir. According to the captain, his father discovered he was alive 6 months ago, during a charity inspection of the mission. They'd been working together since then, gathering evidence. Lord Kensington was already dying of cancer, but someone hastened his end when he got too close to the truth. Reed gathered his coat. Where is Captain Kensington now? Guy's Hospital, sir. The mission nurse got him admitted under a false name. He's fighting the poison, but we're running out of time, Reed finished grimly. In a private room at Guy's Hospital, Edward Kensington lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. Sarah Williams sat beside him, monitoring his vital signs while Inspector Reed paced nearby. The poison is progressing more slowly than with the others, Sarah explained. Perhaps because he ate less of the contaminated food, or perhaps his constitution is stronger. But without the specific antidote. How long does he have? Reed asked grimly. 36 hours? Perhaps less. Edward stirred, his eyes opening briefly. The antidote, he whispered. Harrington or Blackwood must have it. My father's secretary, she can help. Through his delirium, Edward grasped Reed's arm with surprising strength. My father's safe. The combination is my mother's birthday. Evidence there will prove everything, but we need leverage for the antidote. Reed nodded grimly. I'll search both Harrington and Blackwood's offices tonight, and I'll have constables check the pharmaceutical division's records for any missing compounds. Be careful, Edward warned. Whoever did this has powerful allies. Harold Blackwood's office at the Albany yielded nothing suspicious, merely the expected papers of a wealthy industrialist with diverse investments. But when Reed searched Lawrence Harrington's Knightsbridge study, he discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard containing correspondence with an American named Vincent Malone, discussing merchandise and formulations with coded references to distribution networks. More damning still was a small leather case containing vials of clear liquid labelled Compound K7 and Antidote K7. As Reed prepared to leave with his evidence, the telephone on Harrington's desk rang. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. Lawrence? Came an American voice. We've got a problem. That Ellis fellow at the mission survived the poisoning. My sources at the hospital say he's under police protection. Reed remained silent, letting the caller continue. Lawrence? Are you there? Look, we need to accelerate the timeline. Move the remaining formulas tonight. I've got buyers waiting. I understand, Reed finally replied. Where shall we meet? There was a pause. Who is this? Inspector Morgan Reed, Scotland Yard. And you must be Vincent Malone. The line went dead. Armed with this new evidence, Reed returned to the hospital, where Edward's condition had deteriorated further. Sarah reported that the other poisoned men were showing similar symptoms. Progressive nervous system failure that would ultimately prove fatal. I found this in Harrington's study, Reed said, showing them the vial labelled Antidote K7. "But I'm not confident administering it without verification." "We need Harrington himself," Edward whispered. "He would keep the real antidote close." Victor Kensington's former secretary, who had joined them at the hospital, suggested a plan. "I can telephone Mr. Harrington. Tell him Captain Kensington is willing to exchange all evidence for the antidote." "He'll suspect a trap," Reed warned. "Not if we offer something he desperately needs," Edward said weakly. "The contents of my father's safe." Lawrence Harrington was reviewing documents when his telephone rang. His hand trembled slightly as he answered. Malone had warned him the police were closing in. "Mr. Harrington," came a young woman's voice, instantly recognizable as Victor Kensington's former secretary. "I have a message from Captain Kensington." Harrington's grip tightened on the receiver. "Captain Kensington is dead." "I think we both know that's not true," she replied coolly. "He's in hospital suffering from the same poison that has severely sickened the other men at the mission. He's willing to exchange all evidence of your arrangements with the Americans for the antidote." "What evidence?" Harrington asked sharply. "Financial records showing transfers to offshore accounts. Correspondence with Vincent Malone. Everything in Lord Kensington's safe, including the ledger with the W watermark." Harrington's breath caught. The watermark had been Victor's private security measure, documents only he should have been able to access. If Edward had that ledger... "Where and when?" he asked finally. "Thornwood Manor, your country estate in Surrey. Noon tomorrow." After hanging up, Harrington sat motionless, weighing his options. This was clearly a trap. Yet if Edward died without revealing the ledger's location, years of careful work would be jeopardized. Vincent Malone had gone to ground after the interrupted telephone call, leaving Harrington exposed. More troubling still was the question of how Edward Kensington had survived the Somme. He has struggled to answer this question for months now. Harrington had personally verified the death notification when it arrived in 1917. He had needed Captain Kensington eliminated, the only person besides Victor who might recognize the subtle financial manipulations Harrington had begun during the war. Now, both Kensingtons had returned from the dead to haunt him, and someone else knew of his dealings with Malone. Harrington removed a vial from his desk drawer, the true antidote, different from the decoy he kept in the hidden compartment. He would bring it to Surrey, but not without insurance of his own. Earlier, Inspector Reed had already opened Lord Kensington's safe, using the combination Edward provided. Inside was not only the ledger with the damning evidence, but a letter from Victor to his son, explaining his suspicions about both Harrington and Blackwood, and his discovery that one of them was selling pharmaceutical formulas to American criminal organizations. More significantly, the safe contained a recording device, Victor's latest acquisition from America, that had captured his final conversation with his killer. Harrington didn't know these. Edward approached the main gate of Thornwood Manor, a Victorian edifice in a borrowed Austin, Sarah beside him as both medical support and part of his cover. Inspector Reed and several officers followed in separate vehicles, concealed from view. At precisely noon, they were escorted to the conservatory where Harrington waited, outwardly composed, but with tension evident in his rigid posture. A medical case sat on the table before him. "Mrs. Williams," he acknowledged Sarah with a nod, before turning to Edward, studying the familiar eyes behind the scarred face. "I recognized your handwriting months ago, but part of me couldn't believe you'd survived the Somme." "Not quite the reunion you expected, Lawrence," Edward replied, his voice weak but steady. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Edward replied, swaying slightly. The symptoms weren't entirely feigned. Despite Sarah's treatments, the poison was advancing relentlessly. "What exactly do you want?" Harrington asked coldly. "A simple exchange. You have something I need." Edward gestured to the medical case. "And I have something you want." He removed a leather-bound ledger from his jacket, the distinctive W watermark visible on its pages. My father's private records, every transaction, every meeting, every suspicion. Harrington's expression remained neutral, but his eyes betrayed heightened interest. That could be a forgery. Perhaps, but there's also this. Edward produced a small device. My father was fascinated by American technology. This is a recording machine, quite revolutionary. He kept it in his study. He pressed a button, and a scratchy but unmistakable voice filled the conservatory. Victor, be reasonable. The pharmaceutical division is hemorrhaging money. That's not what our research indicates, Lawrence, nor what the Swiss bank statements show. You've been diverting funds for years. You're dying anyway, old friend. Why not let it go? Because those formulas weren't meant for profit. They were meant to help men who fought for our country, men broken by the war. A glass shattering, then a choked sound. I'm sorry, Victor, truly, but Malone's organisation doesn't tolerate loose ends. The recording ended. Harrington's face had gone ashen. You killed him, Edward said quietly. My father was dying of cancer, but you couldn't wait. When he discovered your embezzlement and your deals with Malone, you poisoned him and staged his suicide. He left me no choice. Harrington's composure fractured. He had found too much already. The poison was merciful compared to the cancer eating him away. And Dr. Winters, Edward pressed. Another complication. Victor had written to him before his death. When I saw Winters heading to Whitechapel with that note. So you followed him and murdered him too, then tried to eliminate me, along with anyone who might connect you to the mission. Harrington regained some composure. It seems we understand each other, Captain. Now, about our exchange. The antidote first, Edward demanded, his voice weakening further. Harrington opened the case, revealing a vial of clear liquid. The documents and recording, all copies. As Sarah reached for the vial, the conservatory doors burst open. Vincent Malone entered, flanked by armed men. This is taking too long, Lawrence, he shouted. These two know too much. Harrington paled. We had an agreement, which changed when Scotland Yard became involved. Malone gestured and his men raised their weapons. No loose ends. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Edward lunged for the antidote as gunfire erupted. Sarah screamed, a signal to Reed's waiting officers. The conservatory windows shattered as police crashed through from multiple directions. In the chaos, Edward found himself face to face with Harrington, who had grabbed the vial and was backing away, a concealed pistol now in his hand. It ends here, Lawrence, Edward said quietly. Harrington's face contorted with rage. Indeed it does. He raised the pistol, aiming at Edward's heart. The shot never came. Inspector Reed fired first, the bullet striking Harrington's shoulder. The financial director dropped the gun, crying out in pain, but kept his grip on the precious vial. You still need this, Harrington gasped through his pain, clutching the antidote, and I need assurances. The only assurance you'll get, Reed said coldly, is that your cooperation might spare you the hangman's noose. For a moment, it seemed Harrington might shatter the vial out of spite. Then, unexpectedly, he extended his hand, offering it to Edward. Victor was my friend once, he said quietly. Before Malone, before the debts. Remember that when they speak of me after this. One month later, Edward Kensington stood in Highgate Cemetery before his father's grave, fully recovered from his brush with death. The morning's Times had reported Harrington's sentence, death by hanging, his testimony against Malone's organisation having secured him a private execution at Pentonville Prison, rather than the public spectacle many had demanded. Elsewhere in London, in a boarding house near the docks, one of Malone's lieutenants who had escaped the Surrey raid sorted through papers he had salvaged. including several formulas stolen from Kensington Pharmaceuticals. His employer might be in custody, but business would continue. He carefully placed the papers in a hidden compartment. The game was not quite finished after all. The end? If you love dark twists and unexpected endings, then consider subscribing. I post new crime stories every week.